HIST2316, Modern World History Online or World History 2. So this week we've got a pretty big topic. It's World War II. It's the second time that a global war has emerged in the 20th century. And ultimately what we're concerned with this week is looking at some of the fronts that are opened up, the sort of direction of battle, and then when we look at the end of World War II, what that's going to do is leave us with a post-war balance that will pretty much dominate the latter half of the 20th century. And for those of you familiar with what I'm talking about, we're talking about the onset of the Cold War. So we're going to look at some of the motivations of the belligerents within World War II. There are two sides to this thing. We're on the Allied side, where we're going to have the United States representing the ideology of capitalism, and the Soviet Union, who is representing the ideology of communism. We saw the revolution occur during World War I, but it's going to leave these two global powers ideologically opposed and with nobody else really on their level. These are the two surviving superpowers militarily of World War II. And so they are going to dominate the rest of the conversation of the latter half of the 20th century because people are now split in this ideological battle called the Cold War. And we'll see how that all sort of takes shape when we're done dealing with World War II. So, for those of you widely familiar with this particular history, you're going to know that the major belligerents on the side of the Axis powers are going to be that of Nazi Germany. They're really going to represent the military force of the Axis powers. They are going to be the most expansionist state of those powers, but they are going to be aided by two other allies. And those allies are, number one, within Europe, you have Italy. And the reason for the pairing of Italy and Germany is that both leaders of Nazi Germany and of fascist Italy at this point in time, a guy by the name of Benito Mussolini, they're both attempting to expand their territory and expand their influence. They both believe in the leadership of one strong autocrat, somebody who makes the rules for everybody else, and if you don't follow them, you end up in prison or dead. So just naturally, these two guys are thinking along the same lines. So that's why we're going to see some natural allies between Italy and Germany in World War II. And then we have another growing empire, an empire that is seeking to expand its territory, one that we've been sort of marginally looking at in past weeks, but that is the empire in Japan. The Japanese empire is actively looking to expand its territory in World War II. It took some of Germany's territories after World War I. When they joined in on the side of the Allies. They took a number of Pacific islands, but in the lead up to World War II, the Japanese Empire would also be expanding across the South, Central, and near Pacific when you're looking at sort of the areas moving outwards from the home islands of Japan. They've also established a strong colonial foothold in French Indochina. They've taken that away from the French during World War II. There is a fight going on in which they are claiming sovereignty over the territory of China, and China is going to see a nationalist movement going on there. Ultimately, that nationalist movement will devolve into a civil war between capitalist and communist factions, something we'll look at a little bit later in the course. And they've taken over the Korean peninsula as well. So you can see the Japanese empire is rather expansive. It's trying to go out and claim more territory. And a lot of the territories it's trying to seize in the South Pacific, some of the very strategic ones, belong to the United States. In particular, we're looking at the Philippines here. And that's going to put Japan and the United States at odds with one another in the build-up to America's entrance in the war. But let's look back really quickly. We need to take a look at the end of World War I and the interwar period that we looked at last week to really understand the rise of the Nazis in Germany. With the Treaty of Versailles in 1918, and then further in 1919, it's ultimately ratified, what we're seeing is that the Allied nations are pretty much pinning the blame for World War I on Germany and Germany squarely. And Germany is going to have to pay back reparations that amount to roughly $33 billion. Shortly thereafter, the world goes into a global economic collapse due to the stock market collapse in New York and the United States. That will start the global depression, and that depression is going to hit Germany way harder than some other areas around the globe because Germany's already poor. Germany is already occupied. The Ruhr Valley was occupied by the French from 1923 onward. This is another thing that is irritating to a lot of German citizens. So they're long story short, what the picture I'm trying to paint for you is that Germany is full of a lot of angry and disillusioned people. They're angry with the way World War I came to an end, and they're angry with the way that the rest of the world had treated them at the end of that war. And the Nazis and Germany, at this point in time, they sort of go hand in hand. What the Nazis are offering is a scapegoat and an excuse for why Germans are feeling angry in the way they are. They don't have a time machine. They can't go back and win World War I. That's out of there. So what they're ultimately trying to do is take and find another element of German society upon which they can blame the circumstances that came at the end of World War I and the current economic depression they're experiencing during the 30s. Naturally, we know that Hitler is going to be targeting the Jews, and that's going to lead to the Holocaust, in which millions are killed during World War II. But the first country that Hitler is going to invade after he becomes an elected leader in 1932 is he consolidates power in Germany for about 6 years, and then in 1938 he invades Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia. At which point the British and the French say, that's against the Treaty of Versailles. You're not allowed to go and invade other countries. That was one of the conditions that was put on Germany at the end of World War I. But Hitler turns around to the leaders of the UK and of France, and he basically says, I didn't do anything wrong. All I'm doing is connecting German-speaking peoples. I'm creating a homeland for Germanic people, and nobody in Austria is really throwing a fit that I came in and annexed the country, and something that the Germans call the Anschluss, which means annexation or connection. So he goes and he takes Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, at which point the other European nations that are supposed to be keeping Germany in check, mainly France and Britain, are going to say, that's fine, we're not interested in starting another war over this, and they sign the Munich Agreement, which basically says to Hitler, shame on you for taking Austria, but we're not going to do anything. We're going to sit back and follow what historians have since called the path of appeasement. They don't want to step up and confront Hitler and Nazi Germany. So they allow him to take parts of Czechoslovakia and Austria in 1938. Hitler is emboldened by this. Basically, he sits back and goes, they're going to let me take Austria and Czechoslovakia. I bet I can go and snatch Poland up too, and they're not going to do anything about that either. So Hitler calls upon Stalin in Russia, who is now at the head of the Soviet Union there in Russia, and he's going to basically say to the Red Army in the Soviet Union, let's invade Poland. Let's have a joint invasion of Poland, which Stalin and the Soviets will go along with. They're basically going to split the modern nation of Poland in half. Germany will take the western part, and the Russians will take the eastern part. And so ultimately it is this invasion of Poland in 1939 that forces the British and the French to actually give up this path of appeasement and confront Hitler head on. And from that point, you can see the Western Front gets opened up. This is where actual warfare is going to happen between Nazi Germany and really at first it's going to be Holland, Norway, Belgium and Luxembourg, basically the same areas that the German armies had blazed through in World War I. They're going to do the same thing again. Basically, what Hitler wants to do is consolidate the territory right along the border of the major military power that he's concerned with there in mainland Europe, which would be France. So immediately what they do is they march through most of those European nations, those Western European countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. There's almost zero resistance there. These are not strong military powers. They cannot stand up to the might of the Third Reich and their military prowess. So ultimately what happens here is that Hitler now has his troops amassed along the borders of France by 1940, and his German armies are going to undertake something known as the Blitzkrieg. This is very, very similar to the Schlieffen Plan that we saw during World War I. Basically, what Germany wants to do is they want to blast a hole in the defense of the French armies right on the border and then quickly move troops into the territory of France, at which point Germany's armies can split the French forces in half, divide and conquer, and handle them at their own pace. And that is ultimately going to be happening in 1940. And in all honesty, you don't really see any organized or a structured resistance to Hitler's armies after the French collapse. The Vichy government is put in place in France, which is basically a Nazi puppet government. The legitimate government is going to go into government in exile, and really most of their military hopes with France are going to be placed down in North Africa, with their troops stationed in the colonies of Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia. And so that's going to be taking on really most of the fighting that the French are involved in. Now, in 1941, Hitler goes on and does something that historians consider to be rather inexplicable. He decides to turn on his former Russian allies and decides that after a long bombing campaign against the one remaining military power in the West, which would be the United Kingdom or Great Britain, he's carrying out the Blitzkrieg. He is bombing the city of London daily and nightly. People are hiding in the tube stations to try and find shelter from this. But he can't break the British people's will. So he wants another quick military victory, and he thinks that he can get it by marching into Russia. So he goes east, and now anybody who understands European military history will tell you, don't ever invade Russia. It's a terrible idea. You've got to go through brutal terrain all the way across one of the most massive land masses on Earth, and then you're actually going to be taking on the bulk of the Russian army. By the time your troops are exhausted, they're tired from the weather, they've been beaten in by the very severe cold, and again, inexplicably, Germany decides to invade right in the dead of winter. They're going to try to invade Russia. Doesn't seem like a great idea to me, but I'm not a keen military mind, so we'll leave that one up to the people who know best. But what that's going to do is that's going to open up an entirely new arena of warfare that the Nazis are going to have to fight pretty much on their own. The Italians are not a great military power. And the Japanese are reluctant to confront Russia. They would rather keep expanding around South Asia than go take on Russia head-to-head, because that just doesn't seem like a good use of their resources or time to them. And so Hitler is going to be opening up this Eastern Front after trying to invade Russia. The invasion fails like every other invasion of Russia that I'm aware of. And ultimately, he and his soldiers are going to be bogged down on what's known as the Eastern Front from about 1941 onward. The Russians are going to be keeping him busy there. So that means we have to turn our attention now to the Pacific Theater, because after a few years of warfare, a lot like in World War I, we see the European powers and the other global powers are basically slugging it out for a few years, using a lot of resources, using a lot of manpower, and it's at that point that the United States tends to get involved in these global conflicts. And so when that happens, the United States represents more than just increased military power. They're offering fresh legs. They're offering fresh resources. They haven't gone broke trying to fight this war. We haven't had to institute a draft quite yet. When we come into this war, we have enough volunteers at the outset of the war in the United States to just send people over and really give a new infusion of blood to the Allied powers who have been struggling. It's basically just Britain and Europe now trying to hold the line on the Western Front. But American soldiers are going to come into this conflict untested and untrained. And America's military leadership understands that. So do the Allies. And we delay our support. The United States delays support for Western Europe and for Britain for a short period because they don't think that our soldiers are ready to take on the might of the German military. These are well-trained professional soldiers who have been at it for a few years. So we come up with this military strategy. Ultimately, it's called attacking the soft underbelly of Europe. And to the United States, that looks like North Africa. What they're going to do is they have Italy is sort of penned in. They control Libya. That's their colony. But on either side, on the west of them, they have all the French colonies. And on the east, they have British colonies. And the Italians have tried to invade Ethiopia a number, I think, no less than 19 times in the last roughly 30 years, and they keep getting beaten back by Ethiopia's armies. Long story short, Italy's armies are not well equipped, they're not well trained, and they're not exactly powerful. So America thinks it can get and achieve a very quick military victory, a decisive victory, right at the outset of their involvement in the war by attacking Italy's forces in North Africa, and they are successful in doing that in 1941. And they're going to move up into Europe through the boot of Italy. Now, Mussolini's going to surrender in 1943, and Hitler is going to have to offer German troops up to try and hold Italy. But ultimately, they will be beaten back to the borders of Germany as well as the Allied advance continues in Europe. But, as most of you probably know, Europe is not the reason that the United States gets involved in this war in the first place. The real motivation for the United States to become involved in World War II has everything to do with Japan. Japan and the United States, the relationship between these two countries have been deteriorating since about 1937 onward. When Japan decides to invade China and call it a colony of the Japanese Empire, the United States feels that Japan has violated international law, something called the gentleman's or the open door policy. The open door policy basically says nobody gets to colonize China, everybody should be able to trade freely there, and Japan is now threatening this. In response, the United States cuts off their oil supplies to Japan, and that's going to lead to growing aggression in the Pacific Islands. The Japanese are going to start eyeing in on American territories, but they think that they can get a very quick and decisive victory against the U.S. naval power, basically the power stationed in Hawaii at a place called Pearl Harbor. And the idea on the part of the Japanese here is strike quickly, incapacitate the Americans before they can mobilize naval units to come after us in the Pacific. So they know they have a huge ocean as a natural buffer zone between them and the United States. And their thought is if we can cripple the U.S. military, then we'll have effectively taken them out of the war before they even make a decision to get involved. And so they bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and that will officially draw America into the war. Now, America is going to take the same tactic in the Pacific realm that they took in Europe as well. They're not going to go straight on and attack the Japanese home islands. They're going to go first to the South Pacific and try and take the territory of Guadalcanal. When they take Guadalcanal, they're going to start to move inwards and push towards the Marquesas Islands. And the Marquesas Islands represent something really, really important. Once the United States has taken the Marquesas, their bombers are now in range of hitting Japan's home islands. So from that point in the war forward, when we take the Marquesas by about 1943, you're going to see the United States will start ramping up bombings of all of the home islands of Japan that had any strategic, military or political sort of importance to the Japanese Empire. And so that's going to be how the war starts moving on from 43. And ultimately, Japan is retreating out of the South Pacific, then the Central Pacific, all the way back into their home islands. And the Japanese are hoping that they can force the United States to the negotiating table. They understand by 43, 44, there is no winning this war for Japan. The United States and the Allies will be victorious. It's just a matter of how good of terms can we get when it comes to surrendering or negotiating the end of this conflict. So to that end, the Japanese are going to make things as difficult as possible for the Americans. They start practices such as kamikaze bombings, where their Japanese fighter planes will just start nosediving into American ships to kill as many people as possible. On the islands, Japanese military are fighting to the last man. Basically, until you have killed every last Japanese soldier, you have not pacified an island. And so ultimately what we're looking at here is that the United States in 1945 is going to lose their president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And into his place as vice president, a guy by the name of Harry Truman will step in. The problem that Truman is facing right at the outset of his presidency is that the United States have been working on a secret project for about 4 years, something called the Manhattan Project. Those familiar with this era of U.S. or global history knows that the Manhattan Project is working on designing the hydrogen bomb, the bombs that will ultimately be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. And Truman's faced with a decision. Do I send a ground army into mainland Japan and risk losing roughly 100,000 more American soldiers, or do I end this thing quickly by dropping bombs on places like Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And he ultimately opts for the latter. And after witnessing the might of the hydrogen bombs, the fact that they can wipe out a single city in one bomb, is going to basically signal to the rest of the world, not only is this war over, but the United States now has the undisputed upper hand when it comes to military power. And ultimately, there's one country, and it's not Japan, who's concerned with this. It'll be the Soviet Union, and we'll see why in just a few minutes. But ultimately, after dropping those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese will be forced to the negotiating table, and they will surrender to the Allied powers, bringing World War II to a close. For those of you who want the story of Hitler wrapped up, basically both the Red Army from Soviet Russia and the Allied forces close in on Berlin, the capital of Germany, from both sides. Hitler, rather than surrendering, decides to kill himself in a bunker, and his girlfriend Eva Braun commits suicide there as well. And so ultimately that will bring the hostilities of that time period to a close. But before the war ends, before Franklin Delano Roosevelt even dies, something critical happens in the Black Coast Sea Resort of Yalta. And that is known as the Yalta Conference of 1945. This is critical to world history because it is at the Yalta Conference that Roosevelt, Winston Churchill of the UK, and Joseph Stalin of Soviet Russia are going to get together and start coming up with plans for how the end of World War II and the post-war balance is going to look. And it's at the conference in Yalta that they decide to come up with something to replace the now defunct League of Nations. And that something is the main global peacekeeping body that has been in existence since World War II, one that we still use to try to mediate our global conflicts today. That is the United Nations. This is a global, multinational peacekeeping effort and conflict mediation body. So basically, it's an organization of independent nations that are going to try and deal with problems before they turn into wars. And they're going to be able to do that with sanctions, embargoes, trade subsidies, things of that nature. But unlike the League of Nations, which really was not all that effective, the UN is also going to have a permanent peacekeeping force, meaning that there is a real military arm to the UN. And this is what's going to make it more effective than the League of Nations. But ultimately, as part of this new peacekeeping initiative, the United Nations, the people who got together at the Yalta Conference decided that there should be something known as the UN Permanent Security Council. What this means is that there are 5 nations: the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, also China, and France. So the reason these 5 nations are picked as a permanent security council is they are the major powers fighting for the Allied forces at the end of World War II. And the purpose of this Security Council is to make sure, really more than anything at the time period, they're thinking, we're going to stop Germany from coming up again and starting another war. The main concern is still Germany, and since they had already provoked 2 global wars, the real focus is on trying to keep them in check. But ultimately, this Permanent Security Council is going to have the ability to choose when and where UN peacekeeping efforts are going to be deployed, where are the military forces actually going to get sent, and why. And it also gives them the power of a veto vote. This will severely limit the United Nations' ability to actually mediate global disputes because 2 of the powers that are sitting on that UN Permanent Security Council are ideologically opposed to one another and in the middle of a proxy war throughout the rest of the 20th century. That is the United States and the USSR. Both nations have veto power. So both nations, if every other member state decides to vote for something, 1, either the United States, or 2, the Soviet Union can step up and say, no, we veto that motion because it's not friendly to capitalism or communism, respectively. So really what we're seeing here is that that's going to ultimately, because it's set up to keep the power structure that was there at the end of World War II, it's going to become drastically outdated in the midst of the Cold War. But that's ultimately something that will never change. There is now a shifting Security Council in the UN, but that Permanent Security Council of China, France, the UK, Russia, and the United States will remain the same throughout the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. So, we have the UN set up. World War II is over. And just like at the end of World War I, people are wondering, what is the post-war world going to look like? And here we are left with 2 ideological sort of enemies on our hands. And they were both allies at the end of the war. And that is the United States and the Soviet Union. And this will give rise to the Cold War era. And it all starts at the end of World War II. As I said, both the U.S. and, Allied, I should say, Allied forces and Soviet forces are bearing down on Berlin. And when they get there and they liberate the city of Berlin from Nazi rule, then what they're ultimately going to do is they are immediately opposed to one another. They both have totally different ideas as to how they want to deal with Germany. Simply put, the Russians are pissed off. This is the second time in 30 years that they've been attacked by Germany. They're frankly sick and tired of having to get involved in world wars dealing with Germany, and their goal is they don't really think about how World War I ended, and they basically say, we are going to economically and militarily cripple Germany for as long as we possibly can to ensure that this doesn't happen again. The United States takes a different approach. We're not right on the borders of Germany in the United States. We have this nice little thing called the Atlantic Ocean that separates the U.S. from Germany. So ultimately, they're going to look at the situation and go, we should probably not repeat the mistakes of World War I, where we just give them a huge bill and say pay it back or go broke, because that's what gave rise to the Nazis in the first place. And so ultimately, the United States and the Soviets have totally different plans for how to deal with Germany, and they can't see eye to eye. And that is going to lead to the joint occupation of Germany itself and the city of Berlin. Berlin will be cut up into districts, Berlin being the capital of Germany, and the eastern part of Berlin will be Soviet-run and ruled by the Soviet Union, and the western part will be made up of a joint government of the UK, France, and the United States. Eventually, the United States and its allies will roll all that territory together into one independent government, and ultimately that government will be the government of West Germany. So, really, when we're looking at the United States' tactics and their approach to the Cold War, it's important to understand their policy of containment. And the policy of containment really sort of sums up what both sides are thinking about the Cold War. You have capitalists are fearing communists. Communists are fearing capitalists. They're both worried about the spread of the other one's ideology into a territory that they want to control. And so what they're going to be doing is they're going to be using proxy armies to fight against one another throughout the rest of the Cold War. And this is going to ultimately, out of something called the Long Telegram, the United States forms the containment policy. And basically what it says is, have your military and your economy ready to stand up to the Soviets whenever and wherever they try to expand. In other words, don't go try to take territory away from communism. Just make sure communism doesn't spread any further than it currently has. And that's going to be the same outlook that the Soviets have towards the United States. They're looking at this and going, don't let the United States go dump a bunch of money in Southeast Asia to spread capitalism and impact our ability to influence that area. And so both sides really do fear one another. They don't really well understand the other person's political motivations or ideologies, but this constant fear of the other is going to be driving what we call the three worlds model. And this is a model of critical importance when understanding the rest of global history. What this model does is it basically breaks it into First World, which represents the United States, Western Europe, and some other nations like Canada and Australia, basically English-speaking economies that have been very closely tied to either the Commonwealth of the UK or United States itself, and these independent nations that have come up to become huge world powers. So that is the First World. The Second World refers to the Soviet Union and all of its satellite states. And all of their allies. And so you have the First World is capitalism. The Second World is those who are going along with communism. What that does is it leaves the rest of the world stuck in this position of Third World. And that's where it comes from. This is referring to those developing nations, most of whom are going to be in Africa and Latin America. And they're ultimately going to be left totally underdeveloped as a cause of the Cold War. What we're seeing is that the United States, if they think they can get capitalism to take in an area, they dump tons of money into that country. They support the government. They build schools. They build hospitals. They want goodwill in this territory. The Soviets, if they think they can get communism to hold in the territory, will do the exact same thing. They will dump money into it. They will put resources and military equipment in there to make sure that a territory either stays or goes communist. In the same way the United States is operating on that level. And what that does is it ultimately means that if you're one of these developing nations, ones who were previously colonized and just coming into independence, a process we'll be looking at in the future, it leaves you in this position of align yourself with communism or capitalism, even if your people don't care one way or the other, or else you're going to be left out in the cold. no one is investing money in your nation. And you're basically going to stay poor from the time you get out of colonialism up until the modern age, because nobody's ever dumped the money in globally that are being put into these territories that are going capitalist and communist. However, to pick one side means earning the ire of the other side. If a place like Nigeria had undergone an independence movement and decided, well, I guess we're going to be capitalist now, that means that they put themselves at odds with the Soviet Union and all of their allies, with the Second World. And so the Third World model really develops in relation to the Cold War. And the Third World is really representing these non-aligned states. And these states decide, unless we coalesce together, unless we come together and fight back against what's going on in the global power structure right now, we're really going to be up the creek, because we don't have enough influence on our own to make anything happen as individual nations. And that leads the first president of Ghana, a guy by the name of Kwame Nkrumah, the second president of an independent Egypt, a guy by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the first prime minister of an independent India, a guy by the name of Jawaharlal Nehru. They're all going to get together and form what's known as the non-aligned movement. What this does is it says to these developing nations, you don't have to basically be held hostage by the U.S. or the USSR anymore. You can come align with us, and if somebody threatens you, either capitalist or communist, you have a collective number of nations that you can rely upon for support. And so ultimately, this is going to be very, very important when it comes to how the entire decolonization process plays out in Africa, and how the United States is going to continue to meddle in the internal affairs of Latin America and of Southeast Asia moving forward. We will see hot battles, and they're covered in your slideshow, hot battles of the Cold War like the Korean War. And that's particularly important, as it will sort of fill you in on a lot of the rhetoric and stuff that's going on related to Korea today. But also, this really becomes important throughout the next period of what we call neo-colonialism, where basically newly independent nations that are coming out of colonization are going to have to rely on the support of a larger, more well-established nation. And that means that they are going to constantly be caught up between this ideological conflict of communism and capitalism. If you're becoming an independent nation during the Cold War, which most places in Africa and a lot of places of Asia are as well, you are ultimately going to be forced to deal with this new global power structure known as the Cold War. So that's something that we're going to keep talking about. We'll move on into it in some of our future lectures when we're talking about independence movements and decolonization. But it suffices to say that we're looking at World War II, and we're left with two global military powers, the United States and the USSR, and the rest of the 20th century up until about 1989 to 1991 is going to be dominated by this Cold War rhetoric and the Cold War fear of the spread of either communism or capitalism, depending on which vantage point you're looking from. So, again, I've gone well over my allotted time. I try to keep these short, but I rarely do. So I apologize for that. But if you have any questions, concerns, comments, demagoguery, or diatribe, feel free to shoot me an email or pop by my office hours. Take care.